Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to share with you my grandfather's testimonial that is published in Neville Goddard's Law and Promise. This is the chapter, There Is No Fiction. And this is the exact story that my grandfather told in the interview I had with him that I posted on my channel. I think that most of you have already seen, but I'll post the card to that video at the end of this video. This is the exact story that was published in Neville Goddard's Law and Promise, the same story that my grandfather talks about when I interviewed him. And that's just one of the amazing things that I was able to capture before my grandfather passed away, was to actually get this on film, was to actually interview him, telling me or telling everyone about this story, about how he met Neville Goddard and how he learned how to climb the ladder, how he learned how to create with his imagination, and how he was having these issues with these Arthur Murray dance studios that he was trying to create. He was trying to own multiple Arthur Murray dance studios, and he tried and couldn't do it. But when he met Neville Goddard, he learned how imagination creates reality, and then he started applying it. Within a couple weeks, he had his first Arthur Murray dance studio. Within a couple weeks, practicing Neville Goddard's power of awareness and law of assumption, he got it, and he was convinced. Then he went back to see Neville Goddard after all this and started continuing to go into his meetings, went to the VIP meetings in the back of the Wilshire Ebell Theater. He just had success after success using the law of assumption throughout his life. But there was a point in his life where he was extremely successful, but it took a downturn when he started abusing substances and drugs and alcohol and things like this. And he actually had a lot of bad things that happened to him. He stopped using the law of assumption. Well, you're always using the law of assumption. But when he started consuming drugs and he started consuming all of these, outside sources to make him feel good, he no longer was an intentional creator. And it destroyed a lot of his success. And he had a big downfall after that. But this story begins at the very beginning when he was 19, and he was a ballroom dance instructor is what he was. And then he wanted to own his own Arthur Murray dance studio, which is ballroom dancing. He wanted to own one, and he wanted to create that. But this is the beginning. This is where his success began. But his only downfall was his substance abuse. But that was way later in his life, after he already gained all of his success. And after talking with my grandfather and interviewing him about these things, about the downfall and all of his successes and everything, he said the main part of his downfall was abusing drugs and alcohol. That was the worst thing that ever happened to him when I spoke to him. And that was when the shift, when you could see the shift in his success, is when he started abusing drugs and alcohol. When he was successful and he wasn't abusing drugs and alcohol, he owned the largest Arthur Murray dance studio in the world. He owned the Arthur Murray dance studio in Reno, Nevada, and Bakersfield, California, and then the biggest one in the world, which was Montreal, Canada. But you can see where the shift happened is when he started abusing drugs and alcohol. He actually started opening up strip clubs in California, and he completely let all the Arthur Murray dance studios. So as soon as his conception of himself shifted into someone that abused drugs and alcohol, it completely shifted him to a different person. And that's actually when he divorced my grandmother. That's when all of these things just started tumbling down in his life. And what really happened was he fell into a bad state of consciousness. He shifted into a state of consciousness from the drugs and alcohol. He lost control of his conception of himself, because the mind, when you're on drugs or you're abusing drugs or you're abusing alcohol, you no longer have that control anymore. Your mind is more susceptible to be shifted into a bad state, a state you don't want to be in. And ultimately, that's what happened to him. He went from having over 1,000 employees working for him, as owning all the Arthur Murray dance studios, to owning one strip club in Los Angeles that was ultimately always having issues. The strip club was always having issues with the law because it was a fully nude strip club that served alcohol, and that's against the law in California. But he was able to keep the doors open, but he always had issues with the law when it came down to this, because that's completely illegal. You're not allowed to have a liquor license and have a fully nude strip club. That is illegal. But ultimately, it led to his demise, his abuse of drugs and alcohol, because his whole life was shifted around that. Because if anyone knows that's watching this about strip clubs, it's all about alcohol and drugs and substance abuse and abusing all of these things. So that what that did was shifted him into that state where that's all he thought about anymore was drugs and alcohol and having women all the time, different, varieties of women. So it shifted him into that bad state and ultimately destroyed all of his success that he built. And this is also something that I experienced in my life that I've grown from and I've learned from, because at one point in my adult life that I was abusing alcohol all the time. But I was manifesting things and I knew the law of assumption, but ultimately I was always in a bad state of mind, and it ultimately just destroyed me, and it took me to a place where I didn't want to be, because I'm constantly trying to consume this outside source to something to make me happy. So I wasn't grateful for anything in my life. It didn't matter what I had, I was never happy. And ultimately it destroyed my life, which I am actually planning on getting into my entire life story in 2023. In the beginning of 2023, I'm planning on giving my story, because I've been visualizing a lot of different things on trying to help as many people as possible. And I feel that my story can really, really resonate and help millions of people in the world not to make the same mistakes that I made, and they can just skip that part and then build their self-concept and create the life of their dreams without having to go through everything I had to go through in order to get there. So I want to teach everyone that by telling my story. But all that is going to be coming in 2023. I kind of went off script here, but let's go ahead and get back to the story. All right, so let's begin right here. This is my grandfather's story from Neville Goddard's Law and Promise, from the chapter, There Is No Fiction. All right, so as my story begins at the age of 19, I was a mildly successful dancing teacher and continued in this static state for almost 5 years. At the end of this time, I met a young lady who talked me into attending your lectures. My thought upon hearing you say that imagining creates reality was that the entire idea was ridiculous. However, I decided to accept your challenge and disprove your thesis. And if you've seen the interviews I had with my grandfather, this is exactly what happened. It was actually one of his friends that introduced him or told my grandfather about going to see Neville because of this imagining creates reality. All right, so my grandfather then bought Neville Goddard's book Out of This World and read it many times. Still unconvinced, I set myself a rather ambitious goal. My present position was as an instructor with the Arthur Murray Dance Studio, and my goal was to own a franchise and be a boss of my own Arthur Murray Dance Studio. This seemed the most unlikely thing in the world, as franchises were extremely difficult to secure. But on top of this fact, I was completely without the necessary funds to begin such an operation. Nevertheless, I assumed the feeling of my wish fulfilled, as night after night in my imagination, I went to sleep managing my own studio. 3 weeks later, a friend of mine called me from Reno, Nevada. He had the Murray studio there and said it was too much for him to cope with alone, and he offered me a partnership. And I was delighted, so delighted, in fact, that I hastened to Reno on borrowed money and promptly forgot all about you and your story of imagination. My partner and I worked hard and were very successful, but after a year, I was still not satisfied. I wanted more. I began thinking of ways and means to get another studio, and all my efforts failed. One night, as I was going to sleep or retiring, I was restless and decided to read. As I looked through my collection of books, I noticed your slender volume, which is Out of This World. I thought of the silly nonsense I had gone through 1 year ago before getting my own studio. The words in my mind electrified me. I reread the book that night, and later in my imagination, I heard my superior praise the good job we had done in Reno and suggest we acquire a second studio, as he had a second location ready for us if we desired to expand. I reenacted this imaginal scene night after night without fail. 3 weeks from the first night of my imaginal drama, it materialized. Almost word for word, my partner accepted the new studio in Bakersfield, and I had the Reno studio alone. Now I was convinced of the truth of your teaching, and never again will I forget. Now I wanted to share this wonderful knowledge of imaginal power with my staff. I tried to tell them of the marvels they could accomplish, but I was unable to reach many, although one fantastic incident resulted from my efforts to tell this story. A young teacher told me he believed my story. This is Tony right here, if you remember my grandfather's interview. A young teacher told me he believed my story, but said it would have probably happened anyway in time. He insisted the entire theory was nonsense, but stated that if I could tell him something of an incredible nature that would actually happen and which he could witness, then he would believe. I accepted his challenge and conceived a truly fantastic test. The Reno studio is the most insignificant in the entire Murray system because of all the small population count in the city itself. There are over 300 Murray studios in the country with much larger populations, therefore providing greater possibilities to draw from. So my test was this. I told the teacher that within the next 3 months, at the time of a national dance convention, the little Reno studio would be the foremost topic of the conversations at that convention. He calmly stated that this was quite impossible and could never happen. That night when I retired, I felt myself standing before a tremendous audience. So he's doing this in his imagination, my grandfather. That night, he imagined that he felt himself standing before a tremendous audience and was speaking on creative imagining and felt the nervousness of being before this vast audience. So he's feeling that nervousness, like the actual reality of it happening right now. So he creates that. He's in front of the audience, a tremendous audience. He feels the nervousness of that vast audience. But I also felt the wonderful sensation of the audience acceptance. I heard the roar of applause as I left the stage. I saw Mr. Murray himself come forward and shake my hand. I reenacted this entire drama night after night. It began to take on the tones of reality, and I knew I had done it again. My imaginal drama materialized down to the last detail. My little Reno studio was the talk of the convention, and I did appear on that stage just as I had done in my imagination. But even after this unbelievable but actual happening, the young teacher who threw me the challenge remained unconvinced. He said it all happened too naturally, and he was sure that it would have happened anyways. I did not mind his attitude because his challenge had given me another opportunity to prove, at least to myself, that imagining does create reality. From that time on, I continued with my ambition to own the largest Arthur Murray dance studio in the world. And he did this. He actually got Montreal, Canada, which was the largest. He actually accomplished exactly what he says here. So night after night, in my imagination, I heard myself accepting a studio franchise for a great city. Within 3 weeks, Mr. Murray called me and offered me a studio in the city of 1.5 million people. And it's now my goal to make my studio the greatest and biggest in the entire system. And of course, I know it will be done through my imagination. EOL Jr. All right, guys, that's the end of this video. Don't forget to give me one thing you guys are grateful for. And also, I'm going to pop that card up on the screen for you where you can watch my grandfather's story where I interview him and he's talking about this exact story we just went over. That's published testimonial in Neville Goddard's Law and the Promise, which is the chapter, There Is No Fiction. All right, guys, I love you guys very much, and I'll see you in the next video.